Hey guys, today we're going to do something that sounds simple, almost domestic, but it opens a surprisingly revealing door into the medieval world. Because if you want to understand the Knights Templar, you don't start with swords or legends. You start with a table. You start with bread. You start with the rules of a meal. And here's the twist. The Templars weren't just warriors with a cause. They were men who tried to live like monks while operating inside one of the most militarized frontiers on Earth. Feeding a Templar knight wasn't just dinner. It was discipline, logistics, theology, and status, served on a wooden board under a vow inside an institution that ran on routine. If you enjoy calm, long-form history that doesn't rush the details, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps more curious listeners find these slower, deeper dives. And if you've watched a few of our documentaries already, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure you don't miss the next one. Now, to feed a Templar knight, we need to first place him where he actually lived. The Order of the Temple emerged in the early 12th century, in the wake of the First Crusade, when Western Europe's armed pilgrimage to the Eastern Mediterranean created a new kind of problem. Routes were dangerous. Settlements were fragile. Latin Christian states in the Levant, often called the Crusader states, needed protection, and they needed it constantly. The Templars formed as a religious military order, men who took monastic vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, yet were expected to ride, fight, and guard. That combination shaped everything, including the way they ate. A Templar's food was meant to reflect restraint, not indulgence. Medieval people often thought of diet morally. What you ate, how much you ate, when you ate, and with whom you ate, these were all connected to spiritual health. For the Templars, the meal was part of the rule, a daily practice of order. In theory, a Templar was not supposed to live like a noble household knight, grazing on prestige and pleasure. He belonged to a corporate body with shared resources and shared habits. That didn't mean his life was austere in the modern sense. Medieval plain food could still be hearty, but it did mean the act of eating was regulated, watched, and framed as a kind of training. Picture a Templar house. Part monastery, part barracks, part warehouse, part stableyard. Whether in the Levant or back in Europe, a commandery had to do several things at once. It had to support horses and men, store grain and equipment, handle visitors, manage accounts, collect rents, and maintain a rhythm of prayer. Food sat right in the middle of that system. It was fuel, but it was also administration. Someone had to purchase it, grow it, receive it as rent, store it safely, protect it from spoilage, and issue it in measured amounts. A good medieval institution, religious or military, was, at its core, a machine for turning land into calories and calories into manpower. So what does feeding a Templar knight actually look like in practice? It begins long before the plate. In Europe, many Templar commanderies held farmland, mills, vineyards, and rights to collect dues. They weren't a small band living hand to mouth. They were part of a network that moved goods and money across regions. Grain could arrive as rent from tenant farmers, or as produce from the order's own estates. Wine might come from vines they controlled. Livestock could be raised or purchased. The result was that a Templar meal was often built on staples: bread, pottage, legumes, seasonal vegetables, and whatever protein the rule and circumstance allowed. Bread was not a side item. In the medieval diet, bread was the foundation, especially for any organized household. Grain could be stored. Bread could be baked in predictable quantities. Rations could be calculated. If you want to keep men operational, you start with bread. Alongside it came pottage, a thick, practical stew of grains, peas, beans, onions, and herbs, sometimes enriched with fat or meat. It's easy to underestimate pottage because it's not glamorous, but it's almost perfect for institutional life. It uses local ingredients, it stretches, it warms, and it can be made in bulk. In a commandery kitchen, the big pot isn't just cooking, it's planning. Then there's the question most people jump to: meat. The popular image of medieval warriors is constant feasting, roasts, joints, dripping platters. But monastic rules often restricted meat, especially from four-legged animals, because it was associated with luxury and bodily temptation. Military orders inherited that logic even while living a life that demanded calories. The Templars, like other religious communities, typically had limits and exceptions. Certain days, certain seasons, certain circumstances, certain ranks. Fish might be preferred on fasting days. Poultry could be treated differently than red meat. And when a military campaign or hard labor demanded more, practical need could override ideal restraint. The point is not that a Templar never ate meat. It's that, when he did, it sat inside a moral framework. The order wanted the knight to feel he was eating as a servant of God, not as a lord indulging himself. Meals also weren't just about nutrition. They were about uniformity. A noble knight outside the order might eat privately, or in small circles with conspicuous differences in quality and presentation. But a religious order aimed for a shared table, at least as a principle. In a refectory, you ate with others. The act was communal, and it reinforced hierarchy without encouraging personal luxury. The serving of food could reflect rank, but it was meant to do so quietly, through order rather than display. Even the silence often associated with monastic dining, the idea that eating should not become chatter and distraction, was part of the same purpose: to keep the mind disciplined. And discipline mattered because the Templars lived with constant tension. They were supposed to be humble, yet they handled wealth. They were supposed to be obedient, yet they held authority in frontier zones. They were supposed to reject vanity, yet they wore recognizable insignia and carried immense institutional pride. Food became one of the everyday arenas where those contradictions were managed. If you can train a man to accept a rule at the table, what he may take, what he must leave, how he behaves while eating, you train him to accept rule on campaign, in the stable, in the chapel, in the counting house. Feeding a Templar knight, in other words, was part of producing a Templar knight. Now shift the scene to the Eastern Mediterranean. The Levant was not northern France. Climate, agriculture, and supply chains were different. A Templar stationed in the Holy Land might encounter grains, fruits, and spices that weren't common at home, and he might rely more heavily on local markets, regional harvests, and the flow of maritime trade. Yet the principles remained: staples first, regulations always, and the constant need to keep men and horses fed under pressure. In the Crusader states, everything was expensive in risk. A convoy delayed by weather, a harvest reduced by drought, a route threatened by raiders. Any one of these could change a menu overnight. This is where the romance of the Templars meets the reality. The fate of a garrison can hinge on storage, accounting, and the ordinary work of keeping grain dry. Water and drink mattered too. In many medieval contexts, weak ale or wine was safer than water drawn from uncertain sources, though practices varied by place and season. Wine, in particular, had religious and cultural importance, and the order's estates could supply it. But again, there's the question of moderation. A military religious order had to discourage drunkenness and disorder. A knight who can't manage himself at the table can't be trusted on the road. And then there is the difference between feeding a Templar knight and feeding the order's broader community. The Templars weren't only armored cavalry. They included sergeants, attendants, craftsmen, chaplains, laborers, people whose work kept the institution functioning. The knights sat at the center of the public image, but the kitchen had to serve the whole machine. That meant rations and hierarchy, yes, but it also meant scale. On paper, an order may look like ideals and rules. In practice, it's mouths to feed day after day. A disciplined meal plan is a kind of quiet power. It's also why Templar houses were built the way they were. Storage spaces mattered. Granaries mattered. Cellars mattered. The placement of kitchens, the management of smoke and fire risk, the scheduling of baking and slaughtering and preserving. These details were as much a part of military readiness as weapons maintenance. A knight can only ride as far as his food and forage can follow. In that sense, the Templars were not simply fighters. They were administrators of endurance. There's a final layer here, and it's one people often miss. In medieval Europe, to eat certain foods in certain ways was to signal identity. If you ate like a noble, you were making a claim about your place in society. If you ate like a monk, you were making a claim about humility and piety. The Templars tried to inhabit both categories at once. They needed the martial competence of the aristocratic warrior class, but they also needed the spiritual credibility of religious life. So the table became a stage where the order continuously performed what it claimed to be: restrained, obedient, serious, and set apart. When the Templars later faced criticism, accusations of arrogance, secrecy, wealth, and corruption, the contrast between their vows and their resources became an easy target. And that's why the mundane question of food belongs in the bigger story. The legitimacy of a powerful institution can rise or fall on whether its daily life seems believable. So, feeding a Templar knight was never just what's for dinner. It was the conversion of land into stability, the shaping of behavior into discipline, and the packaging of power into a moral narrative that others could accept, at least for a time. In the next stretch, we'll follow that meal outward, from the refectory into the order's supply routes, its commanderies, and the wider economy that made the Templars formidable, and eventually controversial. When we follow that meal outward, beyond the refectory walls, we begin to see just how interconnected the Templar world truly was. A single loaf of bread on a knight's table might begin its journey hundreds of miles away. Grain harvested on an estate in northern France could be tithed, stored, milled, and recorded in account rolls before ever being consumed. In some regions, the order owned mills outright, allowing them to control both production and profit. Milling grain was not a minor detail in the medieval economy. It was one of its central mechanisms. Control the mill and you control transformation, turning raw harvest into edible substance. The Templars understood this well. Their European properties were not decorative holdings. They were strategic assets. Each manor, vineyard, pasture, or woodland formed part of a financial and logistical backbone that sustained the order's eastern commitments. Revenue generated in England or Aragon could support fortifications in acre or supply garrisons along contested frontiers. Feeding a Templar knight in the Levant, therefore, might depend on the quiet productivity of peasants in Normandy or the careful bookkeeping of a brother in London. This administrative discipline distinguished the order. Medieval warfare often relied on short campaigns and seasonal levies. Armies gathered, fought, and dispersed. The Templars, by contrast, maintained permanent readiness. That required predictable food systems. Grain had to be dried properly to prevent rot. Salt had to be secured for preserving meat and fish. Olive oil, common in the eastern Mediterranean, could replace animal fats and serve both culinary and practical purposes. Even storage vessels, barrels, ceramic jars, sacks, were part of the infrastructure of survival. In the Holy Land, the environment imposed additional realities. Summers were harsh. Water access could determine whether a site remained viable. Fortresses such as those held by the Templars were not merely defensive structures. They were storage hubs. Within thick stone walls, supplies were guarded against both siege and spoilage. Wells, cisterns, and granaries were as critical as battlements. Feeding the garrison during a siege meant planning months in advance. A Templar knight eating his portion inside such a fortress would likely be aware, at least indirectly, of this chain of preparation. The meal symbolized stability. If bread appeared daily, if pottage remained steady, if wine was measured but present, then the institution was functioning. Interruptions in food signaled danger long before enemies breached walls. There is also the matter of hierarchy within the meal itself. Though the rule encouraged uniformity, distinctions did exist. Knights, sergeants, and servants did not always receive identical portions. Rank carried responsibility, and responsibility required physical capacity. A mounted knight, armored and expected to engage in heavy combat, required more calories than a clerical brother copying accounts. Yet overt luxury was discouraged. The difference lay in quantity and necessity rather than extravagance. Silence during meals, often observed in religious communities, reinforced introspection. Listening to scripture or devotional readings while eating reminded the brothers that nourishment was tied to spiritual purpose. The body was maintained so that the mission could continue. Overindulgence threatened both discipline and reputation. Reputation mattered greatly. By the 13th century, the Templars had become one of the most recognizable institutions in Christendom. Their distinctive white mantles marked them instantly. With recognition came scrutiny. Observers expected consistency between vow and behavior. A knight rumored to feast excessively would not merely damage his own standing. he would undermine the moral authority of the order. And so the act of feeding a Templar knight remained tightly bound to the idea of restraint in strength. It was never starvation, nor was it spectacle. It was controlled provision, sufficient, measured, purposeful. In that balance, we see the core tension of the Templar identity. Warriors sustained by a system that insisted they remember they were servants first, fighters second. Beyond discipline and logistics, food also shaped the daily rhythm of a Templar knight's life. The order followed a structured timetable influenced by monastic practice. Prayer divided the day into measured intervals, and meals were woven carefully between these observances. A knight did not simply eat when convenient. He ate when the rule permitted. This created predictability, and predictability created cohesion. Morning would often begin lightly. Medieval breakfasts were not always elaborate affairs, especially within religious communities. A simple portion of bread, perhaps accompanied by watered wine or ale depending on the region, was sufficient to begin the day's duties. The more substantial meal typically came later, after prayer and labor had already shaped the morning. By delaying abundance, the order reinforced the idea that appetite must be governed, not obeyed. Season also played a decisive role. The medieval calendar revolved around fasts and feast days. Lent, in particular, imposed dietary limitations that affected all Christian communities. For the Templars, fasting was not symbolic. It was practiced. Animal products might be reduced. Fish became more central. Legumes and grains filled the space left by restricted meats. These seasonal adjustments required foresight. Supplies of dried fish, preserved vegetables, and stored grains had to match the liturgical year. Feeding a Templar knight in March was not the same as feeding him in September. Climate differences between Europe and the Levant further shaped the table. In the Eastern Mediterranean, access to figs, dates, citrus, and spices introduced flavors less common in Northern Europe. While the rule encouraged simplicity, local adaptation was inevitable. Olive oil, for example, became a practical cooking fat in regions where butter was scarce or impractical in the heat. This subtle blending of Western discipline with Eastern resources reflected the broader reality of Crusader society, imported ideals operating within new landscapes. Another factor rarely considered is the presence of guests. Templar houses sometimes hosted travelers, nobles, or ecclesiastical visitors. Hospitality was part of medieval religious duty. When outsiders dined within a commandery, the meal could become slightly more generous, not for indulgence but for representation. The order's reputation rested partly on visible orderliness and competence. A well-managed table conveyed stability. Even so, the brothers themselves were expected to maintain moderation, regardless of who observed them. Feeding a Templar knight also meant feeding his horse. War horses consumed significant quantities of grain and forage. In many ways, the logistical burden of maintaining cavalry exceeded that of feeding the men. Oats, hay, and water supplies demanded as much planning as bread and wine. A knight's effectiveness depended directly on his mount's strength. Thus, agricultural estates supporting the order had dual priorities: human and animal sustenance. In this layered system, the meal becomes more than nourishment. It is coordination between land, calendar, prayer, rank, climate, and reputation. The knight at the table participates in a network stretching from European farmlands to Levantine fortresses. Each bite reflects structure. Each ration reflects policy. And that is perhaps the most revealing insight of all. The Templars were not sustained by legend. They were sustained by routine. Their endurance, for nearly 2 centuries, depended not only on battlefield skill but on the quiet efficiency of kitchens, granaries, vineyards, and storehouses. Feeding a Templar knight was an act repeated thousands of times, largely unnoticed by chroniclers, yet essential to the order's survival. In the steady rhythm of those meals, we see the foundation of their power and, eventually, the scale of the system that would make their dramatic downfall so consequential. As the 13th century progressed, the sheer scale of that system became one of the defining features of the Knights Templar. What had begun as a small brotherhood protecting pilgrims had grown into a transcontinental institution. With that growth came complexity. Feeding a Templar knight was no longer simply a matter of local harvest and kitchen discipline. It was part of a financial and logistical web that connected farms in England, vineyards in France, ports in the Mediterranean, and fortified strongholds in the Levant. The order developed a reputation for efficiency, and much of that reputation rested on its ability to manage resources with precision. Donations from nobles' land, mills, grazing rights were catalogued and integrated into a structured estate system. Rents were collected, surpluses were sold, profits were redirected. This circulation of wealth allowed the Templars to maintain a standing presence overseas at a time when most medieval forces were temporary. A knight stationed in the east might be eating bread grown on land granted decades earlier by a European patron who would never see the Holy Land himself. The meal embodied continuity between generations of benefactors and brothers. This scale also meant exposure to economic realities. Harvest failures in one region could ripple outward. Trade disruptions, piracy, or political instability could complicate shipments. The order had to hedge against unpredictability. Diversification of estates across multiple territories reduced risk. Storage practices improved resilience. Written accounts, meticulously kept, ensured oversight. In a period when many institutions relied heavily on oral management, the Templars' documentation contributed to stability. Feeding a knight required numbers, and numbers required literacy and oversight. At the same time, perceptions began to shift. Wealth, even when institutionally managed, attracts attention. Observers in Europe saw fortified commanderies, large estates, and steady income streams. They saw knights who, while bound by vows, operated within a financially powerful organization. The contrast between the simplicity expected of monastic life and the visible resources of the order created tension. Critics questioned whether restraint at the table truly reflected restraint in governance. Yet within the daily routine, moderation largely remained the standard. The rule did not vanish as the order grew. Meals were still structured, portions regulated, and fasting observed. But public perception does not always hinge on internal practice. It hinges on visibility. A well-stocked storehouse, necessary for survival during siege or famine, could appear excessive to those outside the walls. Feeding a Templar knight required surplus by design. Resilience demands reserves. What looked like abundance might, in practice, be calculated prudence. In the final decades of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, pressures intensified. Muslim forces regained territory. Coastal strongholds became lifelines. Supplying these outposts grew more difficult and more expensive. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked a decisive end to large-scale Latin Christian rule in the region. For the Templars, this loss transformed their operational purpose. Without major territorial holdings in the Levant, the justification for maintaining such a vast military religious apparatus became less clear to some European rulers. Back in Europe, political dynamics shifted. Monarchs consolidated authority. Financial demands increased. The Templars' resources, once admired, now appeared tempting. In 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the arrest of Templar members within his realm. Accusations followed, serious, sensational, and deeply controversial. Trials unfolded over years. Eventually, the order was formally dissolved by papal decree in 1312. When we consider that dramatic collapse, it is easy to focus on courtroom drama, confessions, and political maneuvering. But beneath it all lies the quiet foundation we have been tracing. Land, food, routine, and structure. The very efficiency that once allowed the order to feed its knights reliably across continents also made it a significant economic entity within European society. Its assets were measurable. Its estates were visible. Its stores were tangible. Feeding a Templar knight, then, becomes symbolic of the order's entire trajectory. In the beginning, it reflected humble discipline in service of a fragile frontier. In its maturity, it represented the power of organized resource management. And in its final years, it stood as evidence of wealth and capability that rulers could not ignore. What remains today are fragments, ruins of commanderies, archival records, references in chronicles. The meals themselves have vanished, as all meals do. Yet the structure that sustained them offers insight into medieval institutional life at its most disciplined. The Templars endured for nearly 2 centuries not because of legend, but because they mastered the ordinary: how to grow, store, ration, and regulate. In the end, feeding a Templar knight was an act repeated countless times, steady and unremarkable, and it was precisely in that repetition, calm, ordered, and deliberate, that the strength of the order once quietly lived. Even after the formal dissolution of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century, the structures that once fed a Templar knight did not simply vanish. Estates were transferred, often to the Knights Hospitaller. Storehouses were inventoried. Livestock was reassigned. The fields still required plowing, the mills still turned, and bread still had to be baked. In many cases, daily life on former Templar properties continued with minimal immediate disruption. The difference lay not in the grain itself, but in the authority overseeing its distribution. This continuity reminds us of something essential. Medieval institutions were not abstract ideals. They were systems embedded in land and labor. When we imagine the Templars, it is tempting to picture mounted warriors beneath bright crosses. Yet their endurance depended less on battlefield spectacle and more on agricultural routine. The disappearance of the order did not erase the agricultural calendar. Spring planting followed winter rest. Harvest followed growth. Livestock required tending regardless of political upheaval. The rhythm of sustenance outlived the brotherhood that once coordinated it. Looking back, feeding a Templar Knight offers a surprisingly clear lens into how medieval power functioned. Authority rested on the ability to provide stability. A knight who could rely on regular meals could remain focused on duty. A garrison supplied through winter could hold territory. A commandery that managed surplus effectively could fund fortifications and transport. The order's identity as both monastic and military only intensified the need for internal balance. Too little provision would weaken the body. Too much indulgence would weaken discipline. The narrow path between those extremes defined their daily practice. There is also a broader social dimension. Peasants farming Templar lands were not abstract figures in a ledger. They were families whose harvests sustained a trans-regional enterprise. In return, they operated under a structure that promised protection, legal order, and, at times, economic opportunity. The relationship was not equal, and it was shaped by medieval hierarchies, yet it formed part of the web that made each meal possible. Feeding a Templar Knight involved not only brothers in white mantles but also millers, shepherds, vintners, fishermen, and carters. The meal on the table represented the combined labor of many unseen hands. Over time, memory reshaped perception. Later centuries layered myth upon the Templars. Secret rites, hidden treasures, coded knowledge. These stories often obscure the practical realities of institutional life. But if we strip away legend and return to the refectory, to the measured serving of bread and stew, we find something more grounded and arguably more impressive. The order's achievement was organizational coherence in an era defined by fragmentation. Their daily sustenance was not dramatic, yet it was dependable. And in the medieval world, dependability was power. Imagine the quiet scene one final time. A stone hall, light filtering through narrow windows, brothers seated in order, a simple meal distributed without excess. Perhaps a reading from scripture carried across the room as spoons moved steadily. Outside, horses stamped in stables. Beyond the walls, fields or coastlines stretched toward uncertain horizons. The knight eats, not hurriedly, not lavishly, but deliberately. He rises when required, ready for prayer, patrol, or travel. The meal has done its work. In that ordinary act lies the essence of the Templar experiment. They sought to merge contemplation with combat, devotion with defense. Feeding a Templar Knight was the daily negotiation between those aims. It sustained the body while reminding the spirit of its vow. Connected distant estates to distant frontiers. It reflected discipline in small things so that larger responsibilities could be carried. And perhaps that is why examining something as simple as a meal can illuminate an entire era. Through bread and grain, through fasting and rationing, through storage and supply, we glimpse the machinery behind medieval institutions. The Knights Templar did not endure because they were mysterious. They endured because they mastered the fundamentals of organization in a demanding world. Long after their banners fell and their trials concluded, the lesson remains. Power in the medieval age was not only forged in battle. It was cultivated in fields, recorded in ledgers, guarded in granaries, and served quietly, consistently at the table. If we widen the lens even further, feeding a Templar Knight also reveals how medieval institutions balanced ideology with physical reality. The Order's founding ideal was protection, safeguarding pilgrims and defending fragile Christian territories in the eastern Mediterranean. But ideals alone cannot sustain mounted warriors across decades. They require calories, infrastructure, and predictability. The Templars succeeded, for a time, because they transformed devotion into administration. Consider the journey of a single campaign season. Before a knight ever mounted his horse, months of preparation had already shaped his readiness. Grain from prior harvests would have been measured and stored. Salted fish or preserved meats prepared in advance. Wine casked and monitored. Fodder for horses allocated carefully. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and stable hands all depended on the same steady supply of food that sustained the knights. In that sense, feeding a Templar Knight was inseparable from maintaining the entire ecosystem of the commandery. There is also a psychological dimension that should not be overlooked. Regular meals reinforce morale. In unstable frontier environments, where uncertainty was constant, the reliability of daily routine anchored the mind. A disciplined refectory, where brothers gathered at set hours, created continuity. Even when news from the front was troubling, even when supply lines felt vulnerable, the act of sitting together and eating from shared provisions reaffirmed belonging. Institutions endure not only through force but through repetition. The table was one of the Order's most consistent rituals. As the Crusader states contracted in the late 13th century, the strain on this system intensified. Coastal cities became isolated outposts. Naval transport grew more significant. Feeding a garrison in such conditions demanded greater coordination between European estates and Eastern strongholds. Maritime trade routes connected ports like Marseille, Genoa, and Venice to the Levant. Ships carried grain, wine, and other provisions alongside reinforcements and correspondence. Weather delays or naval threats could disrupt this delicate balance. Every successful delivery represented logistical achievement rather than inevitability. When Acre fell in 1291, it marked not just a territorial loss but a logistical rupture. The physical geography that justified the Order's eastern presence had shifted dramatically. Without major fortresses to defend in the Holy Land, the Templars' military identity seemed less anchored. Yet their estates in Europe remained extensive. They still possessed the means to feed knights, but the question increasingly asked by secular rulers was, to what end? In France, England, Iberia, and beyond, monarchies were consolidating power. Kings sought tighter control over resources within their realms. A wealthy, transnational order that answered ultimately to the papacy rather than to local crowns could appear politically inconvenient. The Templars' ability to manage land and wealth efficiently, once admired, now carried different implications. Feeding a Templar Knight required assets that kings themselves often wished to command. It is important, however, to separate later accusation from daily reality. Within the commanderies, life likely remained structured and procedural until the very end. Meals were still served, prayers were still recited, accounts were still tallied. The shock of arrest in 1307 would have been all the more profound precisely because routine had seemed stable. The same granaries and kitchens that had sustained the order through wars now stood witness to its unraveling. After the dissolution, many former Templars dispersed quietly into other religious communities or returned to secular life. The agricultural estates continued under new management. Bread was still baked in the same ovens. Horses were still fed from the same fields. The physical systems outlived the institutional name. In this way, feeding a Templar Knight becomes a reminder that medieval power structures were deeply rooted in land and labor rather than in symbols alone. Today, when we walk through the remnants of a Templar commandery, stone walls softened by centuries, we are not simply looking at a military relic. We are seeing the outlines of kitchens, refectories, storage rooms, and barns. We are seeing the architecture of sustenance. Behind every legend of crusading valor stood an organized routine of provision. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson. The Knights Templar were remembered for their battles and for their dramatic end. Yet their true strength, for nearly 200 years, rested in something far quieter. It rested in the dependable transformation of harvest into nourishment, of nourishment into readiness, and of readiness into service. Feeding a Templar Knight was not a grand ceremony. It was a daily affirmation that structure, when carefully maintained, can carry an institution across generations, even in a world defined by uncertainty. There is one final perspective worth considering, and it brings us back to the individual man seated at the table. It is easy to describe systems, estates, ships, and storehouses in abstract terms. But each meal ultimately met a human body shaped by vow, training, fatigue, and expectation. A Templar Knight was not only a component within an institution. He was a person navigating hunger, discipline, climate, and conscience. Most Templar Knights came from the lesser nobility of Europe. Many had grown up in households where food was a marker of rank and hospitality. Feasting was part of aristocratic culture. To enter the order meant stepping away from that social rhythm and into something more regulated. The transition would not have felt trivial. It required learning to accept uniform portions, to eat at prescribed times, to submit appetite to rule. In this sense, feeding a Templar Knight was also reshaping his identity. The table became a quiet training ground where aristocratic individuality gave way to collective obedience. Yet the order did not aim to erase strength. Knights were expected to remain physically capable. Campaigning in armor under a Levantine sun demanded resilience. Long patrols, construction work on fortifications, and the management of horses required sustained energy. The balance between restraint and adequacy was delicate. Too little nourishment weakened performance. Too much indulgence threatened discipline. The rule sought equilibrium, and achieving it across different climates and decades required constant adjustment. It is also worth remembering that medieval food was deeply seasonal. There were no modern preservation technologies, no refrigeration in the contemporary sense. Salting, drying, smoking, and fermenting extended shelf life, but availability still fluctuated. Fresh vegetables appeared and disappeared with harvest cycles. Fruit ripened briefly, then had to be consumed or preserved. Even in well-managed estates, abundance in one month could give way to limitation in another. Feeding a Templar knight required awareness of these natural rhythms. The institution could mitigate scarcity, but it could not eliminate seasonality entirely. In times of regional hardship, poor harvests, drought, or local conflict, the Order's network offered a degree of insulation. Surpluses from one territory could offset shortages in another. This flexibility was one reason the Templars became financially respected. They functioned, in part, as a stabilizing structure within the broader medieval economy. But insulation was not immunity. Extreme conditions tested even the most organized systems. The strength of the order lay in preparation rather than in vulnerability. There is a symbolic layer here as well. Medieval Christianity placed spiritual meaning on fasting and moderation. Voluntary restraint at the table was seen as a way to cultivate humility and self-control. For the Templars, whose lives combined prayer with combat, this symbolism carried additional weight. The same discipline that governed appetite was meant to govern fear, anger, and pride. In theory, the knight who mastered himself at meals would be steadier under pressure. Feeding him moderately was therefore part of shaping his moral character. When the order fell, dramatic narratives overshadowed these quieter realities. Trials, confessions, and political maneuvering dominate popular memory. But beneath those events lay nearly 2 centuries of daily repetition. Bread distributed, pottage stirred, wine poured carefully, scripture read aloud. The endurance of that routine is what allowed the Templars to project power across regions. Their fall was sudden. Their sustenance had been steady. In the end, examining how to feed a Templar knight brings us closer to the lived texture of medieval institutional life than any battlefield account alone could. It shows us that strength was cumulative. It was built from harvests, from ledgers, from disciplined kitchens and orderly refectories. It depended on cooperation between farmers, merchants, clerics, and warriors. It required foresight more often than heroics. And perhaps that is the quiet takeaway. History often remembers institutions for their dramatic moments, their founding and their collapse. But what sustains them in between is rarely dramatic. It is structured routine, repeated without spectacle. The Knights Templar were no exception. Their legend may rest on armor and trials, but their survival rested on something much more ordinary: the reliable transformation of land into nourishment and nourishment into purpose. Feeding a Templar knight, then, was never just about food. It was about discipline made practical, faith made logistical, and power made sustainable. Through that simple, repeated act, we glimpse how a medieval order held itself together across continents and generations, until the political winds shifted, and even the most carefully managed table could no longer guarantee protection. If we step back one last time, we can see that feeding a Templar Knight was, in many ways, a reflection of medieval civilization itself. The order did not exist outside its era. It was a concentrated expression of it. Land defined wealth. Agriculture defined stability. Faith defined legitimacy. Violence, when organized and sanctioned, defined political reality. And food connected all of these elements in one daily act. In 12th and 13th century Europe, most people lived close to the edge of subsistence. Harvest outcomes shaped everything from marriage prospects to military campaigns. A good harvest allowed lords to fund ventures and monasteries to expand. A failed harvest tightened every system. The Templars operated within this environment but attempted to buffer themselves against its volatility through structure. Their estates were geographically dispersed. Their record-keeping was deliberate. Their routines were standardized. Feeding a Templar Knight reliably year after year was evidence that this buffer was functioning. It also demonstrated the order's hybrid identity. Unlike a purely monastic community, the Templars were not cloistered from worldly responsibility. Unlike a purely secular military household, they were not free to indulge in aristocratic display. They occupied a narrow middle ground. Their refectory symbolized this balance. It was not a lavish banquet hall, yet it was not a place of starvation. It was disciplined, communal, and purposeful. The connection between diet and readiness cannot be overstated. Medieval warfare required stamina more than speed. Campaigns were slow, sieges prolonged, travel exhausting. Armor was heavy. Horses required constant attention. A knight weakened by poor nutrition would struggle to fulfill his role. The order's emphasis on moderation, therefore, served both spiritual and practical ends. Feeding a Templar Knight adequately ensured operational capability. Restricting excess reinforced unity and obedience. There is also something revealing about how little contemporary chroniclers say about daily meals. They rarely describe them in detail. That silence suggests normality. The system worked well enough that it did not draw attention. Chroniclers wrote about battles, diplomacy, miracles, and trials. They did not write about the steady arrival of bread at noon. And yet, without that steady arrival, none of the dramatic events would have been possible. When the order was accused and eventually suppressed, the accusations did not center on food or famine. They centered on secrecy, ritual, and wealth. But wealth, in a medieval context, was inseparable from land and its produce. The estates that had once ensured stable provision now symbolized power that secular rulers wished to control. Feeding a Templar Knight required resources. Those resources, once admired, became politically significant in new ways as monarchies strengthened. Even after the order's dissolution, the agricultural model it had refined did not disappear. Other institutions absorbed its lands and practices. The Hospitallers inherited many properties. Secular lords gained others. The continuity of agricultural production demonstrates a broader truth. Institutions rise and fall, but the systems that sustain human life endure beyond them. Fields remain. Mills turn. bread is baked. For modern observers, focusing on something as grounded as a meal allows us to approach the Templars without the distortion of legend. It brings them back into historical proportion. They were neither mystical conspirators nor invincible warriors. They were members of a disciplined organization that depended on careful management of resources. Their success was not magical. It was methodical. Imagine again that quiet hall. Long tables, simple vessels, measured portions. Outside, carts move between storehouses. In distant fields, peasants harvest grain that will one day arrive here. At a port city, a ship unloads barrels destined for a commandery inland. The network hums, largely unseen. The knight eats, rises, and resumes his duties. Nothing dramatic occurs. And yet, through thousands of such uneventful days, an institution maintains its presence across continents. That is perhaps the most enduring insight. Grand narratives often overshadow the small, repetitive actions that make them possible. The Knights Templar became a symbol of medieval militancy and later of medieval intrigue. But at their core, they were sustained by the ordinary. Feeding a Templar knight was an act of continuity, linking farm to fortress, vow to vitality, structure to survival. In studying that act, we uncover not just the dietary habits of a warrior monk, but the anatomy of medieval organizational power. And in that steady, measured rhythm of bread and broth, we find the quiet foundation upon which one of history's most famous orders once stood. As we bring this exploration to its final stretch, it is worth reflecting on how something as ordinary as a meal allows us to humanize an institution that is so often treated as abstract or mythical. The Knights Templar have been reimagined countless times in novels, films, and popular speculation. They are portrayed as guardians of secrets, as shadowy financiers, as symbols of lost crusading glory. Yet none of those images survive contact with hunger. Every knight, no matter how legendary he later became in memory, required bread, water, and rest. Feeding a Templar knight anchors him firmly in the material world. It reminds us that beneath the white mantle marked with a red cross stood a body subject to fatigue and climate. In the Levantine heat, dehydration and malnutrition could weaken even the most devout warrior. In the damp winters of northern Europe, insufficient stores could undermine morale. The order's leadership understood this reality. Their regulations, estate management, and storage practices were not peripheral concerns. They were the infrastructure of survival. It is also telling that the Templars' dietary framework reflected a broader medieval understanding of balance. Medieval medical theory, shaped by classical ideas about humors, linked diet to temperament and health. Certain foods were believed to produce warmth, others coolness, some dryness, others moisture. While modern science has moved beyond these frameworks, they influenced how medieval communities thought about nourishment. Moderation was not merely spiritual. It was considered physically prudent. Within this worldview, the structured meal supported both moral and bodily equilibrium. The communal nature of Templar dining reinforced hierarchy without encouraging fragmentation. Everyone knew his place. Everyone understood the order of service. This clarity mirrored the battlefield, where cohesion determined effectiveness. The refectory was, in a subtle way, rehearsal space for unity. Shared meals cultivated shared identity. The absence of ostentatious feasting distinguished the order from purely secular courts, where banquets often served to display wealth and prestige. And yet, paradoxically, the order's very efficiency contributed to suspicion. An institution capable of sustaining knights across continents, of maintaining estates and shipping supplies reliably, inevitably accumulated influence. In a medieval political landscape where authority was contested and alliances fragile, concentrated influence attracted scrutiny. When Philip IV of France moved against the Templars in 1307, the logistical competence that had once sustained crusading missions could not shield them from royal power. Still, even during the turmoil of arrests and trials, daily routines would have continued for a time. Bread ovens did not immediately go cold. Livestock still required feeding. Records still needed maintenance. The contrast between calm domestic repetition and dramatic political upheaval is striking. It reminds us that history often shifts at the top while continuity persists at the base. Looking back from a modern perspective, we can see that feeding a Templar Knight encapsulates the strengths and vulnerabilities of medieval institutions. Strength came from organization, land carefully administered, provisions calculated, discipline enforced. Vulnerability came from visibility, wealth and coordination that could be redirected or seized when political circumstances changed. In the end, the Templar story is neither purely triumphant nor purely tragic. It is complex, rooted in the realities of its time. By tracing the path from field to table, from harvest to refectory, we gain insight into how ideals were translated into daily life. The Order's mission required courage and conviction, but it also required routine and rationing. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson that lingers. Institutions that aspire to shape history must first master the ordinary. They must feed their members, sustain morale, and maintain structure through uneventful days as well as dramatic ones. The Knights Templar managed this for nearly 2 centuries. Their legacy, stripped of embellishment, rests not only in the chronicles of crusade or in the drama of suppression, but in the steady, repeated act of nourishment that allowed their world to function. So when we ask what it meant to feed a Templar Knight, we are really asking how a medieval order turned land into endurance, rule into habit, and habit into historical presence. And in that answer, we glimpse the deeper truth of the medieval world itself, that behind every banner and every battle stood the quiet certainty of a meal prepared, served, and consumed in disciplined silence. There is something almost poetic in ending where we began, at the table, not because the table is dramatic, but because it is ordinary. And in the medieval world, the ordinary was everything. When a young noble entered the Order of the Temple, he surrendered more than property and personal ambition. He surrendered control over the smallest patterns of his day. When he would rise, when he would pray, when he would ride, and when he would eat, the structure that governed his meals was the same structure that governed his vows. Feeding a Templar Knight was therefore an act of obedience as much as nourishment. Over time, that obedience accumulated into institutional identity. The repetition of shared meals built cohesion between men from different regions and languages. A knight from Burgundy might sit beside one from England or Aragon. Their accents differed. Their homelands differed. But the rule was the same. The portion was the same. The rhythm of the day was the same. Food became one of the quiet tools that unified a trans-European brotherhood. It also grounded them in reality. Crusading ideology could be expansive and visionary, filled with rhetoric about sacred duty and eternal reward. But hunger has no rhetoric. It is immediate. The order's success depended on translating vision into sustenance. Without grain shipments, without salted provisions, without functioning kitchens, no fortress could hold for long. No patrol could ride far. No vow could be enacted in physical space. Even the architecture of Templar sites reflects this truth. Excavations and surviving structures reveal storage rooms built with care, drainage systems designed to protect supplies, and refectories positioned centrally within compounds. These were not decorative spaces. They were practical ones. The physical layout of a commandery often placed nourishment at the heart of daily life, symbolically and functionally reinforcing its importance. When the order fell, its mythology began to grow. Over centuries, stories layered themselves onto the Templars, sometimes detached from evidence. But archaeology and archival research consistently return us to the same grounded reality. Estates, accounts, provisions, routine. The glamour of later legend fades beside the steady record of agricultural management and communal living. And yet, this does not diminish the Templars. If anything, it makes their achievement more impressive. They sustained a disciplined, multinational military religious institution for nearly 200 years in an era without centralized bureaucratic states, without modern banking systems, and without rapid communication. They did so by mastering coordination of land, labor, animals, ships, and schedules. They built reliability in a world defined by uncertainty. Feeding a Templar knight, then, was not a trivial domestic detail. It was the visible outcome of invisible systems working correctly. It was proof that harvests had been gathered, rents collected, ships dispatched, accounts balanced, and discipline maintained. Each meal represented layers of trust. Trust between donors and the order, between commanders and local stewards, between brothers seated side by side. Perhaps the most striking aspect of all is how quiet it must have felt. No fanfare accompanied the distribution of bread. No trumpet marked the pouring of watered wine. The importance lay in consistency. The knight ate, prayed, trained, rode, returned, and ate again. Through thousands of such cycles, the order endured. In studying how to feed a Templar knight, we step away from spectacle and toward substance. We see how medieval institutions lived from day to day. We see how spiritual aspiration depended on practical provision. We see how power was maintained not only by courage, but by organization. And that may be the enduring image worth holding on to. Not the charge of cavalry or the drama of arrest, but a long wooden table in a stone hall. Bread broken evenly. A simple stew ladled carefully. Scripture read softly in the background. Outside, fields stretch under a shifting sky. Inside, men bound by rules sustain themselves for the work ahead. In that quiet moment, the legend dissolves, and history becomes tangible. The Knights Templar were sustained, quite literally, one meal at a time. As a final reflection, it may help to consider how deeply food ties memory to history. We remember eras through monuments and battles, but the people who lived within those eras experienced them through daily repetition. For a Templar knight, the taste of coarse bread, the texture of lentil pottage, the measured cup of wine, these were constants. Campaigns might change. Commanders might rotate. Political winds might shift. But the structure of sustenance remained reassuringly familiar. That familiarity reinforced the order's internal culture. Medieval life was often unstable. Travel was slow and dangerous. News moved gradually. Illness and injury were common risks. Within that broader uncertainty, the Templar commandery offered predictability. The refectory bell signaled order. The seating arrangement signaled hierarchy. The shared meal signaled belonging. Feeding a Templar knight was, in part, feeding that sense of stability. It is also important to remember that scarcity was never far from the medieval imagination. Famine, though not constant, was a recurring fear across Europe and the Mediterranean. Climatic shifts, crop disease, or conflict could strain supply. The order's determination to maintain reserves and diversify holdings was a rational response to this reality. Surplus was not extravagance. It was insurance. A well-stocked granary could mean survival during siege or drought. To outside observers, abundance might appear excessive. To those responsible for defense, it was prudence. This dynamic reveals a broader truth about institutions that straddle religious and military identities. They must convince supporters that their resources are used ethically, while simultaneously maintaining enough strength to fulfill demanding objectives. The Templars navigated this tension for generations. Their dietary rule embodied that balance. Disciplined enough to signal piety, substantial enough to sustain readiness. Over time, however, perception can detach from practice. By the early 14th century, as European monarchies grew more assertive, the order's autonomy and assets became politically sensitive. The very networks that once enabled the reliable feeding of knights across continents now symbolized independence from royal authority. When the arrests began in 1307, kitchens and refectories would have continued their routine for a short while, even as uncertainty mounted. It is striking to imagine ordinary meals being served under the shadow of extraordinary accusation. And yet, when we strip away later drama, what remains is the steady cadence of institutional life. The Templars did not sustain themselves through mystery. They sustained themselves through management. They turned agricultural productivity into operational endurance. They translated vow into habit. They converted donation into logistics. Feeding a Templar knight was the daily proof that the system still functioned. It meant fields had yielded harvest. It meant stewards had accounted accurately. It meant ships had sailed successfully. It meant discipline had held. That quiet proof repeated over decades gave the order its reputation for reliability. Today, when historians reconstruct the medieval world, They rely heavily on records, charters, inventories, account books. These documents often include references to grain stores, livestock numbers, wine production, and food allocations. Such details may seem mundane beside tales of crusade, yet they provide the clearest window into how the order actually operated. Through them, we see that the Knights Templar were administrators as much as warriors. So if we ask one final time what it meant to feed a Templar Knight, the answer extends beyond the meal itself. It meant sustaining an idea through practical means. It meant supporting a religious military experiment with land-based economics. It meant aligning spiritual discipline with agricultural productivity. And it meant repeating this alignment consistently enough that it became unremarkable. History often celebrates decisive moments, but endurance is built in quieter spaces, in stone kitchens, in storerooms carefully sealed against moisture, in refectories where men eat in measured silence before returning to their duties. The Knights Templar endured for nearly 2 centuries because those quieter spaces functioned. In the end, the image that lingers is simple. A knight removes his gloves. He sits among brothers. Bread is passed. A bowl is filled. Outside, the world remains uncertain. Inside, order prevails, at least for now. And in that modest, disciplined act of nourishment, an entire medieval institution finds the strength to continue. If we allow ourselves one last layer of reflection, we can see that feeding a Templar Knight also represents something broader about how medieval institutions attempted to control time itself. In a world without modern clocks, without industrial scheduling, structure was created through repetition. Bells, prayers, meals, labor. Time was marked not by minutes, but by rituals. The refectory was one of those markers. When the brothers gathered to eat, they were not only sustaining their bodies, they were participating in the rhythm that ordered their entire existence. This rhythm was deliberate. The rule of the temple, influenced by earlier monastic traditions, aimed to reduce chaos in both spirit and behavior. By regulating meals, what was eaten, when it was eaten, how it was eaten, the order reduced variables. Predictability in small matters cultivated predictability in greater ones. A knight accustomed to discipline at table would, in theory, remain disciplined in formation. A brother trained to accept ration portions would be less likely to resent hardship in the field. Feeding a Templar Knight was therefore a form of training that never ceased. There is also a deeply practical truth embedded in this structure. Medieval warfare was slow. Campaigns were drawn out. Sieges could last months. Patrols across rough terrain demanded endurance more than explosive speed. Sustained nutrition mattered far more than occasional abundance. The order's dietary moderation, plain but sufficient, suited this reality. Heavy feasting might satisfy ego, but it did not build resilience. The Templars' approach reflected long-term thinking. They were not preparing for a single day of glory. They were preparing for years of vigilance. The connection between food and horses, too, cannot be overstated. Cavalry defined the Templars' battlefield identity. Yet horses required immense resources. Grain for mounts often exceeded grain for riders. Water access determined not only where men could survive, but where cavalry could function. A fortress without reliable water storage was a liability. Thus, feeding a Templar knight included feeding the animal that extended his mobility and power. The agricultural estates back in Europe indirectly supported these animals as much as the men who rode them. When Acre fell in 1291 and the last major Crusader strongholds collapsed, the Templars' logistical identity faced a crisis. Without territorial anchors in the Holy Land, their reason for maintaining such extensive supply chains grew less obvious to observers. Their estates still functioned. Their refectories still served meals. But the outward mission that justified this complex apparatus had changed. Institutions built for one geopolitical reality sometimes struggle when that reality dissolves. Even so, the final years of the order were not marked by immediate famine or collapse from within. The system that fed Templar Knights continued to operate effectively right up to the moment external political forces intervened. That fact is significant. It suggests that the order's downfall was not rooted in logistical failure. Their kitchens were not empty. Their granaries were not barren. Instead, their vulnerability lay in politics, specifically in the ambitions of monarchs who recognized both the wealth and independence embedded in Templar estates. In 1307, when arrests were ordered in France, many Templars were likely going about their routine. Morning prayer, duties, perhaps a measured meal. The sudden rupture between daily stability and political upheaval must have felt jarring. For decades, feeding a Templar knight had been evidence of continuity. Now, the same structures would be inventoried, seized, and reassigned. Bread would still be baked, but not under the same authority. And this brings us to an enduring historical lesson. Institutions often appear strongest at the height of their organization. The Templars' disciplined network of estates, ships, fortresses, and refectories made them formidable. Yet that very organization made them visible. In a medieval landscape increasingly shaped by centralized monarchies, visibility carried risk. Wealth and coordination attracted both admiration and envy. Today, stripped of legend, the Templars offer a study in how power is sustained quietly, not only through courage or faith, but through accounting, agriculture, and repetition. Feeding a Templar knight becomes a metaphor for institutional endurance. It required foresight in planting, care in storage, discipline in distribution, and restraint in consumption. It required trust across distances, between European donors and Eastern garrisons, between commanders and stewards, between brothers seated side by side. If we imagine that stone refectory one final time, we might notice what is absent. There is no spectacle, no applause, no chronicler taking notes. There is simply the quiet act of nourishment, repeated day after day. Outside, political currents shift. Armies rise and fall. Kings negotiate and conspire. But inside, bread is broken evenly. And perhaps that is the most honest image of the medieval world. Behind every dramatic episode stood systems of survival that rarely drew attention. The Knights Templar were sustained not by myth, but by method. They lived not only on the battlefield, but at the table. Through the steady rhythm of measured meals, they transformed land into loyalty, discipline into durability, and faith into functioning reality. Feeding a Templar Knight, in the end, was an act both humble and profound. It was humble because it dealt with basic human need. As we close this long journey, it's worth recognizing that something as simple as a meal allows us to see the Knights Templar not as distant symbols, but as participants in the same human rhythms that shape every era. Hunger, routine, discipline, community, these are constants across centuries. When we ask what it meant to feed a Templar Knight, we are really asking how a medieval institution translated belief into daily practice. The Templars stood at the intersection of devotion and defense. They were born from a specific historical moment, the aftermath of the First Crusade, when new Latin Christian states in the Eastern Mediterranean required protection. Over time, they developed into a structured, multinational order with estates stretching across Europe. Yet no matter how wide their geographic reach became, their survival depended on something remarkably grounded. Land had to be cultivated, supplies had to be transported, meals had to be prepared. This grounded reality challenges the way later centuries romanticized them. It is tempting to imagine the Templars as figures constantly in motion, charging across battlefields or guarding sacred relics. In truth, much of their existence unfolded in stillness, in courtyards, in stables, in storerooms, in refectories. Feeding a Templar Knight was part of that stillness. It was the pause between duties, the reinforcement between campaigns. The communal meal reinforced the order's internal hierarchy without encouraging fragmentation. Every brother knew his position. Portions were measured. Excess was discouraged. Silence or scripture often framed the act of eating. In this structured environment, individuality gave way to shared identity. A knight from England and one from Provence might have little in common culturally, yet at table they were equal under the rule. The meal erased regional differences in favor of collective discipline. It also connected the order to broader medieval society. Peasants worked fields that ultimately sustained commanderies. Merchants transported goods between ports. Artisans maintained tools and ovens. Feeding a Templar Knight was not an isolated event. It was the final stage in a chain of labor that spanned villages and trade routes. The order's power rested not only on its vows, but on its integration into these networks. When political winds shifted in the early 14th century, it was not because the kitchens had failed. It was because power structures within Europe were evolving. Monarchs sought greater control over resources within their realms. The Templars' transnational identity, once useful, became complicated. Their estates, carefully managed to ensure steady provision, became assets that rulers could repurpose. The same organization that had sustained knights across continents now made the order visible and vulnerable. And yet, even in dissolution, the systems they built did not collapse into chaos. Estates were reassigned. Agricultural cycles continued. Bread was still baked in ovens once managed by Templar brothers. The endurance of these practical structures underscores a final truth. Institutions may fall, but the rhythms of sustenance endure. In the end, feeding a Templar Knight was an act that combined faith, agriculture, logistics, and discipline into a single daily ritual. It sustained bodies prepared for defense. It reinforced vows taken in humility. It linked distant lands through coordinated effort. And it did so quietly without spectacle. If we step back and consider the full arc of their story, from their founding in the 12th century to their suppression in 1312, we can see that their strength was cumulative. It was built not only in moments of bravery, but in countless ordinary days where systems functioned correctly. Meals were prepared, horses were fed, accounts were balanced, prayer was observed. The repetition of these actions created stability in a volatile world. So perhaps the most honest way to remember the Knights Templar is not solely through their banners or their trials, but through their discipline, through the steady conversion of harvest into nourishment, through the measured portions that sustained men who believed they were serving something larger than themselves. Feeding a Templar Knight was never about indulgence. It was about endurance. It was about ensuring that the body could carry the weight of armor, of responsibility, of expectation. And in that steady, repeated act of sustenance, we glimpse the true foundation of one of medieval Europe's most enduring and most debated institutions. Long after the legends fade, the image that remains is simple. A stone hall, a shared table, bread divided evenly, and men preparing quietly for whatever the next day would demand. If we linger just a little longer in that stone hall, we begin to understand something deeper about medieval endurance itself. The Knights Templar operated in a world defined by fragility. Borders shifted, alliances dissolved, harvests failed, disease moved unpredictably. Yet within that instability, the order attempted to construct reliability. And reliability in the medieval world began with food. Feeding a Templar Knight was not a symbolic gesture. It was risk management. Every loaf represented planning. Every preserved ration represented foresight. Every regulated portion represented discipline enforced long before crisis arrived. In an era without refrigeration, without industrial farming, without rapid transportation, maintaining a consistent food supply across regions was an achievement of coordination. The Order's European estates were not glamorous in themselves. They were fields, barns, vineyards, mills, but collectively they formed a stabilizing web. Income from English sheep pastures might support fortification repairs in the Levant. Wine from French vineyards might be shipped through Mediterranean ports to supply distant garrisons. Even small donations, an orchard here, a meadow there, became threads in a larger tapestry of provision. Feeding a Templar Knight in Acre could, indirectly, depend on weather in Burgundy. This interconnectedness required trust. Donors trusted that their land would be used responsibly. Brothers trusted that stewards managed resources honestly. Commanders trusted that shipments would arrive when promised. At the table, that trust became tangible. The arrival of bread and stew signaled that unseen systems were functioning as intended. It also signaled something psychological: continuity. Medieval life did not offer many guarantees, but the repetition of meals created a sense of order within uncertainty. For men stationed far from their homelands, perhaps never to return, that familiarity mattered. The rules standardized practice so that whether a knight was in a French commandery or a Levantine fortress, the structure of his day would feel recognizable. In that way, feeding a Templar knight helped maintain morale across cultural and geographic distance. There is a tendency in modern storytelling to reduce the Templars to their dramatic end: arrests, interrogations, papal decrees. But those final years represented only a fraction of their existence. For nearly 2 centuries, the order functioned as a discipline machine. It trained recruits. It managed estates. It negotiated with rulers. It fought when necessary. And every day it fed its members in accordance with its rule. Even during sieges, when supplies were strained, the principle of measured distribution remained. Rations could be reduced, but structure persisted. The ability to endure scarcity without collapsing into disorder was itself a mark of strength. Feeding a Templar knight under such conditions required careful calculation. How long could stores last? How much grain could be spared for horses? How should portions be adjusted without damaging morale? These were questions of leadership as much as logistics. When the order was suppressed in the early 14th century, it was not because it had failed to sustain itself materially. It was because political landscapes had changed. Monarchs, particularly in France, sought greater control over wealth and authority. The Templars' independence and assets became liabilities in a shifting balance of power. Yet even then, the estates did not crumble. They were absorbed into other institutions, most notably the Hospitallers. The land continued to yield grain. The ovens continued to bake bread. This continuity reinforces a final insight. The true legacy of the Templars lies not only in legend, but in method. They demonstrated that medieval institutions could operate across vast distances with consistency. They showed that disciplined routine could sustain a complex organization in an age without centralized bureaucratic states. Feeding a Templar knight was one visible expression of that capability. So if we imagine that knight once more, seated, silent, listening to a reading as he eats, we are witnessing more than a meal. We are witnessing the culmination of agricultural cycles, maritime trade, financial record-keeping, spiritual regulation, and communal trust. The simplicity of the bowl hides the complexity behind it. In the end, the Templar's story reminds us that history is built from repetition. Grand events depend on small, reliable acts. Institutions endure not because they are mysterious, but because they manage the ordinary well. For the Knights Templar, endurance meant turning fields into fortresses through steady provision. Feeding a Templar knight was, therefore, an act both humble and foundational. It grounded belief in bread, turned vow into vitality, and transformed land into longevity. And in that steady rhythm, meal after meal, year after year, we find the quiet strength that carried the order through 2 centuries of medieval change. If we take one final, steady look at the world that sustained the Knights Templar, we begin to see that feeding a Templar knight was part of a much larger medieval truth. Survival belonged to those who could organize resources better than their rivals. In a fragmented political landscape, where authority was divided among kings, lords, bishops, and city-states, the ability to maintain internal cohesion was rare. The Templars achieved it not through spectacle, but through structure. Their daily meal represented the success of that structure. It meant that agreements with tenants had held, that harvests had been stored properly, that transportation routes remained functional, that corruption or mismanagement had not disrupted supply. Medieval institutions were vulnerable to breakdown at many points: poor oversight, theft, environmental disaster, or political interference. The fact that the Templars maintained a relatively stable internal economy across multiple kingdoms for nearly 2 centuries speaks to disciplined administration. It also highlights the relationship between land and legitimacy. In medieval Europe, land was not merely property. It was identity and authority. By accumulating estates through donation, the Templars embedded themselves within local economies. Villages farmed under their oversight. Mills operated under their rights. Vineyards produced under their stewardship. Feeding a Templar Knight depended directly on this land-based legitimacy. Without it, there would have been no grain to mill, no livestock to raise, no wine to press. Yet land also anchored them in political realities they could not fully control. As monarchy strengthened in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, rulers increasingly viewed powerful landholding institutions through a strategic lens. The Templars' estates, once symbols of pious generosity, became strategic assets in the calculus of royal finance. Their ability to feed and equip mounted warriors across regions signaled organizational independence. In more centralized states, independence could be interpreted as competition. Still, if we momentarily set aside the politics of their suppression and return to the daily refectory, we see something enduringly human. A man removes his riding cloak. He washes his hands. He sits among brothers. A steward distributes bread. A server ladles stew from a pot that has simmered for hours. Perhaps dried herbs flavor the broth. Perhaps fish replaces meat because the calendar calls for restraint. There is no excess, but there is sufficiency. This sufficiency mattered deeply. Medieval thought did not equate virtue with starvation. The body was understood as a vessel that required care. Overindulgence was a vice, but so too was negligence. The Templars' dietary moderation reflected this balance. Their rule aimed to prevent pride without weakening resolve. Feeding a Templar Knight was a matter of measured adequacy, enough to sustain strength, restrained enough to maintain humility. Even their architectural remains echo this philosophy. Surviving commanderies often reveal practical design over ornament. Kitchens were built for volume and efficiency. Storage spaces were carefully positioned. Water systems were prioritized. These were not afterthoughts. They were integral to the order's identity. A fortress could only defend if it could endure. Endurance required calories. As centuries passed and myth layered itself over the Templars' memory, the quiet competence of these systems faded from public imagination. Treasure hunts replaced tenant records in popular narratives. Hidden codes overshadowed harvest cycles. But for historians, the account books and agricultural charters tell a clearer story. They show an institution deeply engaged with the realities of land management and food distribution. In the end, Feeding a Templar Knight allows us to see past both romanticism and condemnation. It shows us a medieval order functioning through repetition and reliability. It reveals how belief was translated into bureaucracy, how prayer coexisted with provisioning, how armor depended on agriculture. And perhaps that is the most grounded conclusion we can reach. The Knights Templar were sustained not by legend, but by labor. Not by secrecy, but by supply chains. Not by mythic abundance, but by measured meals shared in disciplined silence. When we imagine that final scene, a long table beneath stone arches, bread divided evenly, voices quiet, we are witnessing the true engine of their endurance. Through countless ordinary days, the act of nourishment bound together faith, land, hierarchy, and purpose. Feeding a Templar Knight was simple in appearance, but within that simplicity lay the full complexity of medieval institutional life. And in that steady rhythm of bread and broth, we find the foundation upon which their remarkable and ultimately finite history was built. If we allow the story to settle into its quietest register, we begin to see that feeding a Templar Knight was also about continuity between generations. The order did not exist for a single campaign or a single leader. It was designed to endure beyond the lifespan of any individual brother. Young recruits entered, older knights aged. Some died in battle or from illness. Others returned to Europe for administrative roles. Through all of this turnover, the system of sustenance remained steady. The meal was one of the few constants that bridged generational change. A novice entering the order in the late 12th century would have encountered a rhythm already established. By the mid-13th century, that rhythm would feel ancient, embedded in the identity of the brotherhood. Recipes may have varied slightly by region, ingredients may have shifted with climate, but the principle endured: communal, measured, regulated nourishment. Feeding a Templar Knight was not reinvented each decade. It was inherited. That inheritance also reinforced institutional memory. The rule of the temple, shaped in the order's early years, laid out expectations that later brothers continued to follow. In a period when many political entities were unstable or short-lived, this consistency offered strength. The order's ability to replicate its internal structure across multiple commanderies meant that a knight transferred from one region to another did not have to relearn daily life from scratch. The table would feel familiar. The pattern of restraint would be recognizable. There is something revealing in how medieval religious military orders approached self-control. Control over appetite was seen as foundational. If a man could govern hunger, he could govern impulse. If he could accept measured portions, he could accept hardship. The refectory was not merely a dining space. It was an environment of discipline. Feeding a Templar Knight was therefore part of shaping temperament. And temperament mattered in frontier environments. The Crusader states required vigilance, patience, and cooperation with allies of varying loyalties. Emotional excess, whether anger, pride, or indulgence, could destabilize fragile alliances. The daily ritual of moderation subtly reinforced steadiness. Even when conflict erupted, the internal culture of the order sought to temper reaction with rule. As the political climate of Europe evolved in the late 13th century, the Templars' disciplined cohesion stood in contrast to emerging centralized monarchies. Kings were building more direct administrative systems. Royal taxation, standing bureaucracies, and centralized courts were expanding. In that environment, a transnational order with its own rules, properties, and internal discipline could appear both impressive and inconvenient. The same qualities that had allowed the Templars to feed and sustain knights across continents made them structurally distinct from increasingly centralized states. Yet at ground level, daily life likely felt unchanged right up until the moment of crisis. Kitchens operated. Bread was baked. Stewards recorded deliveries. Brothers gathered for prayer and meal. That juxtaposition between quiet routine and sudden political rupture underscores how history often unfolds. Systems can appear stable internally even as external forces gather momentum. After the dissolution, many former Templar properties passed to the Hospitallers. In practical terms, fields still produced grain. Ovens still warmed kitchens. The transfer of authority did not erase agricultural cycles. This continuity reinforces the idea that the Templars' logistical model was effective. It did not collapse under its own weight. It was overtaken by political recalibration. And so we return once more to the human scale. A knight seated at table would not have perceived himself as part of a grand historical arc. He would have felt hunger, perhaps fatigue from training or patrol. He would have listened to readings, shared glances with brothers, accepted his portion. That ordinary experience, repeated thousands of times across decades, created the lived reality behind the order's reputation. Feeding a Templar knight was never dramatic. It did not leave monuments or chronicles of its own, but it was the quiet backbone of a complex institution. It linked belief to biology, administration to appetite, land to loyalty. In the end, the story of the Knights Templar is not only one of crusade or controversy. It is also one of endurance through organization. And endurance in the medieval world began with the most basic question: how will we eat tomorrow? For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars answered that question with discipline and structure. Through harvests gathered, stores managed, and meals measured, they sustained an order that left a lasting imprint on history. Long after their banners disappeared and their trials concluded, the essential rhythm they relied upon remains recognizable. Bread broken in community, food shared under rule, strength drawn from sustenance. In that simple, repeated act, the Templars found the stability that carried them through an uncertain age. If we allow ourselves one final, measured reflection, we can see that feeding a Templar knight ultimately reveals something universal about power in the medieval world. Authority was only as durable as its ability to sustain bodies. Grand ideals, sacred missions, royal charters, all depended on food reaching the table. Without that, vows weakened, fortresses emptied, and loyalties frayed. The Knights Templar understood this instinctively. Their founders may have been driven by religious zeal and the urgent needs of the early Crusader states, but survival quickly demanded organization. The order evolved into a structure capable of converting European agricultural output into military endurance thousands of miles away. That transformation did not happen accidentally. It required systems of oversight, trust, and repetition. Every commandery functioned as a node in a larger network. Grain collected in one region could be sold to fund purchases elsewhere. Surpluses might be redirected strategically. Estate managers had to calculate yields carefully, accounting for seasonal fluctuation and storage risk. Feeding a Templar Knight meant that these calculations had proven accurate. It meant that loss through spoilage or mismanagement had been avoided. In a time without modern insurance or rapid communication, that level of coordination was impressive. There is also a quieter cultural layer to consider. Medieval Christian thought framed daily acts as opportunities for spiritual alignment. Eating was not morally neutral. It could cultivate gratitude or excess, humility or pride. Within the Templar rule, moderation at table reinforced spiritual purpose. The meal was taken not as a private indulgence, but as communal necessity. Even silence during dining, common in religious settings, turned nourishment into reflection. For knights accustomed to aristocratic environments before entering the order, this shift would have been significant. Feasts in noble households often displayed wealth and reinforced hierarchy through extravagance. In contrast, the Templar table emphasized uniformity. Status still existed, but spectacle was restrained. Feeding a Templar Knight required enough to maintain strength, but not enough to cultivate vanity. As the centuries progressed and the order's wealth increased through donations and careful management, this restraint became symbolically important. The more land the Templars controlled, the more essential it was that their internal culture reflect discipline. Whether perception matched reality in every case is difficult to measure. But structurally, the rule aimed to prevent visible excess. When the political climate turned against them in the early 14th century, the systems that had sustained them could not shield them from royal authority. Their granaries were full, their estates productive, their internal routines intact. Yet institutional strength does not guarantee political protection. Monarchs like Philip IV of France recognized both the material value and strategic significance of Templar holdings. Once arrests began, no amount of administrative competence could reverse the tide. Still, the endurance of their logistical model is evident in what followed. The redistribution of their lands did not erase the agricultural framework they had refined. Other institutions inherited it and continued to operate it. Bread continued to be baked in ovens once managed by Templar brothers. Fields continued to yield under new oversight. The method outlived the name. And that may be the most fitting conclusion. The Knights Templar were not sustained by mythic treasure or hidden knowledge. They were sustained by harvest cycles, measured rations, and disciplined routine. Feeding a Templar Knight was a daily affirmation that land, labor, and leadership were aligned. If we picture that final image once more, a long wooden table beneath stone arches, bowls set evenly, light filtering through narrow windows. We see not grandeur, but steadiness. A brother bows his head briefly before eating. Outside, horses shift in their stalls. Somewhere beyond the walls, Peasants gather grain that will one day appear here. The world remains uncertain, but within these walls, order prevails. In that quiet steadiness lies the essence of their story. Through 2 centuries of upheaval, expansion, contraction, and eventual suppression, the Templars endured by mastering the ordinary. They fed their knights consistently. They linked estate to fortress, vow to vitality, rule to resilience. And in the end, that is how history is truly sustained, not only through decisive events, but through the reliable repetition of daily acts. Feeding a Templar knight was one such act. Simple, structured, foundational. As we reach the quiet edge of this story, it becomes clear that feeding a Templar knight was not merely a logistical necessity or a monastic discipline. It was a reflection of how medieval institutions understood survival itself. In a time when life expectancy was uncertain, harvests unpredictable, and political alliances fragile, the ability to provide consistent nourishment was a form of stability that few organizations could achieve across generations. The Templars' achievement was not that they ate differently from other medieval communities in substance, but that they embedded eating within a durable framework of rule and repetition. Bread, legumes, occasional fish or meat, wine in moderation, these were not extraordinary foods. What was extraordinary was the consistency with which they were supplied across distance and time. A knight stationed in the Levant in 1180 and another stationed in Cyprus in 1280 would have recognized the same disciplined structure at table. That continuity bridged a century of change. And change there was. The geopolitical world that produced the Templars in the early 12th century was not the same world that witnessed their dissolution 200 years later. Crusader states rose and fell. Trade routes expanded. Monarchies consolidated power. Financial systems grew more sophisticated. Yet through all of that transformation, the internal rhythm of the order, prayer, labor, meal, rest, remained remarkably stable. Feeding a Templar knight symbolized that internal stability. It meant that estates were functioning despite wars and weather. It meant that supply lines were intact despite piracy or shifting alliances. It meant that leadership maintained oversight across commanderies spread through England, France, Iberia, Italy, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Each meal was quiet evidence of organizational health. It is also worth recognizing that food bound the Templars to the very societies that sometimes questioned them. The peasants who farmed Templar lands were not abstract contributors. They lived under the same seasonal pressures as all medieval communities. Their harvests shaped the order's capacity to sustain its knights. In turn, the order's stability could influence local economies. Mills operated, markets functioned, livestock traded. Feeding a Templar knight was therefore part of a larger rural ecosystem. When accusations emerged in the early 14th century, they did not center on famine or collapse. They emerged from political ambition and shifting power dynamics. Yet even during the trials, daily life in many commanderies likely retained its rhythm for a time. Bread was still needed. Ovens were still lit. Horses were still watered. The contrast between ordinary continuity and extraordinary upheaval reminds us how layered history can be. Once the order was officially dissolved in 1312, much of its property transferred to the Hospitallers. The fields did not vanish. The granaries did not empty themselves. The physical systems endured because they were practical and effective. What disappeared was the specific identity of the men who had once gathered under the Red Cross to share those meals. In reflecting on this, we arrive at a broader insight. Institutions often become larger than the individuals within them. The Templars' identity was sustained by repetition, by meals served in silence, by rations measured carefully, by rules observed consistently. That repetition forged cohesion. It also made the order resilient enough to project influence across continents. And yet, resilience has limits when confronted by concentrated political force. No matter how well organized, an institution embedded in a web of monarchies must navigate power carefully. The Templars managed that balance for generations. When it finally failed, it was not because they could no longer feed their knights. It was because authority in Europe was consolidating in new ways. So perhaps the final image worth holding on to is not dramatic at all. It is steady. A knight sits at a wooden table. He breaks bread that began as seed months earlier. He eats food shaped by weather, labor, and rule. He listens as scripture is read. Around him, brothers follow the same pattern. Outside, history continues to unfold in unpredictable directions. In that simple act of nourishment lies the core of their endurance. Feeding a Templar knight was how belief became sustainable. It was how land became loyalty, how discipline became durability, how an idea survived not just in moments of battle, but in the ordinary passage of days. And in the end, that is where the true strength of the Knights Templar once lived, not only in fortresses or in legend, but in the steady, measured rhythm of bread shared beneath stone arches, year after year, until the world around them changed beyond their control. If we take one final, unhurried step back, what emerges most clearly is how deeply physical the Templars' world was. It was a world of soil under fingernails, grain dust in the air, smoke rising from ovens, salt curing fish in storerooms, and horses stamping in stables. For all the later myths that would surround them, the Knights Templar lived in a material reality that required constant, careful attention. Feeding a Templar knight was not symbolic theater. It was maintenance of body, of morale, of mission. The medieval economy was overwhelmingly agricultural. Nearly all wealth began in the field. A good harvest meant stability. A poor one meant strain. By acquiring and managing estates across Europe, the Templars tied their fortunes to this agricultural cycle. But they did so strategically. Their properties were dispersed geographically, which reduced the risk that a single regional failure would cripple the entire order. Grain shortages in one area might be offset by abundance in another. This geographic spread was not accidental. It was a form of medieval risk distribution. That distribution required management. Stewards oversaw estates. Accounts were recorded. Supplies were inventoried. Shipments were coordinated. In an age without instant communication, instructions traveled slowly. Decisions had to anticipate problems months in advance. Feeding a Templar knight in the Eastern Mediterranean might depend on harvest reports written in Latin months earlier in France or England. This time lag demanded foresight. The Order's leaders could not react quickly to crisis. They had to prevent it. Inside the commandery, the meal itself reinforced a disciplined culture. Food was distributed in portions, not seized individually. The act of receiving rather than choosing underscored obedience. In secular noble households, banquets could be displays of personal prestige. In the Templar refectory, the emphasis lay on collective sufficiency. That distinction mattered. The Order's identity rested on humility within strength. The knight was a warrior, but he was also a vowed religious brother. It is easy to overlook how psychologically stabilizing such routine could be. For men living far from their birthplaces, stationed in climates harsher than those they had known, predictability offered comfort. The structure of prayer and meal anchored identity. Feeding a Templar knight meant reinforcing belonging, reminding him that he was part of a disciplined brotherhood rather than an isolated soldier. At the same time, the Order's material competence made it economically significant. They became trusted custodians of property and funds. Their logistical expertise extended beyond food into finance and transport. Yet this competence carried consequences. By the late 13th century, European monarchs were strengthening their own administrative systems. A wealthy, organized, and relatively autonomous institution operating across borders inevitably drew scrutiny. When Philip IV of France ordered the arrest of Templars in 1307, it was not because their kitchens had failed or their granaries stood empty. It was because their resources, accumulated through decades of disciplined management, had become politically valuable. Their ability to feed and equip knights consistently signaled a level of independence that monarchs increasingly wished to absorb or control. Still, the Order's daily life did not dissolve instantly. Even under accusation, routines likely continued until confiscations took effect. Meals were served, horses were fed, records were maintained. The quiet inertia of institutional life persisted even as political tides turned. That contrast between steady routine and sudden rupture is one of the most striking elements of their history. After the official dissolution in 1312, the transfer of properties to the Hospitallers ensured that the agricultural framework remained productive. Fields were too valuable to abandon, mills too useful to dismantle. The land continued to yield grain long after the Templar name had faded from official use. In this sense, the Order's logistical legacy outlived its legal existence. And so we arrive at a grounded conclusion. The Knights Templar were sustained not by mystique, but by management. Not by hidden treasure, but by harvest. Feeding a Templar knight encapsulated their achievement. The steady conversion of land into operational endurance. It required discipline from the individual, oversight from leadership, cooperation from tenants, and stability across regions. Imagine that final, quiet scene once more. A refectory at dusk. Bowls arranged evenly. Bread distributed without excess. A reading echoing gently across stone walls. Outside, the world remains unpredictable. Kings negotiating, borders shifting, armies moving. Inside, for this moment order holds. That moment, repeated thousands of times across 2 centuries, is where the true story of the Templars resides, in the measured rhythm of nourishment, in the patient alignment of belief with practicality, in the understanding that even the grandest mission must begin with the most basic human need. Feeding a Templar Knight was simple in appearance. Yet within that simplicity lay the full machinery of a medieval institution at work. And in that steady machinery, we find the quiet strength that carried the order through generations, until history, shaped by forces beyond the kitchen and the field, finally moved in another direction. If we let the camera linger just a little longer on this world, one final dimension comes into focus. Feeding a Templar Knight was also about shaping reputation. In medieval society, perception carried enormous weight. Institutions survived not only because they functioned internally, but because they were believed to function honorably. The Templars depended on donations from nobles, patronage from rulers, and the goodwill of communities across Europe. Their internal discipline at table was part of the outward story they told about themselves. A knight who lived modestly reinforced the image of a brotherhood committed to service rather than luxury. Visitors to a commandery would have observed order, restraint, and quiet efficiency. The absence of indulgent feasting signaled seriousness. In a culture that valued visible piety, moderation at meals served as proof of integrity. Feeding a Templar Knight in measured portions was not only practical, it was reputational. This matters because medieval institutions operated within dense networks of trust. Land was granted because benefactors believed the order would use it responsibly. Sons were allowed to join because families believed the rule would shape them honorably. If the Templars had developed a reputation for extravagance or disorder, those networks might have weakened much earlier. Their structured communal life, including diet, helped sustain confidence for generations. Yet reputation is fragile. As the order grew wealthier and more administratively sophisticated, perceptions began to shift. The same estates that once symbolized pious generosity could be interpreted as concentrated power. The same logistical strength that allowed knights to be fed reliably across continents could be seen as independence from royal oversight. In times of political tension, even disciplined moderation might not shield an institution from suspicion. Still, for most of their history, the Templar system worked remarkably well. Consider the sheer continuity required. From the early 12th century through the end of the 13th, brothers in widely separated regions followed comparable routines. They prayed at similar hours. They observed fasting periods. They gathered for shared meals governed by the same rule. That replication across distance suggests not only administrative skill, but cultural cohesion. Feeding a Templar Knight, therefore, represented a daily reaffirmation of shared identity. It did not matter whether he stood in a fortified complex in the Levant or in a rural commandery in England. When he sat at table, he participated in the same discipline pattern as his brothers elsewhere. That shared pattern was stronger than regional difference. It was the backbone of the order's unity. There is also a deeper lesson about sustainability. Medieval campaigns were expensive, dangerous, and uncertain, but agricultural cycles were predictable in their repetition. By rooting their survival in land-based income rather than in constant conquest, the Templars created a stabilizing base. Victories might expand influence, defeats might contract territory, but fields, if managed carefully, continued to yield. Feeding a Templar Knight year after year depended more on stewardship than on battlefield success. When their suppression came in the early 14th century, it did not erase that stewardship. The land endured, the mills endured, the systems of food production and distribution endured under new authorities. What vanished was the institutional framework that had coordinated them. This distinction is important. The Templars did not collapse from logistical failure. They were dismantled by political recalibration. And so we return one last time to the image that has guided this entire exploration. A stone refectory, light filtering through narrow windows, brothers seated in quiet order, bread divided evenly, a bowl passed from hand to hand. No spectacle, no applause, just sufficiency. In that scene, we see the essence of the Knights Templar stripped of later embellishment. We see an institution grounded in repetition. We see how belief was sustained not only through courage, but through calories. How discipline was reinforced not only in battle, but in restraint. How endurance was cultivated not through extravagance, but through measured provision. Feeding a Templar Knight was an ordinary act, but history is often carried forward by ordinary acts repeated consistently. Through harvest and storage, through ration and rule, through silence and shared purpose, the Templars sustained themselves across 2 centuries of profound change. Long after the charges and trials, long after the banners fell, the deeper story remains this: institutions endure when they master the everyday. And for the Knights Templar, mastery of the everyday began at the table. As we bring this final reflection into focus, it becomes clear that feeding a Templar Knight was, in many ways, a quiet form of governance. The medieval world did not separate administration from daily life. Authority was exercised not only through decrees and campaigns, but through the management of resources, especially food. To control supply was to control stability. To maintain regular nourishment was to maintain order. Within the Templar commandery, food distribution followed hierarchy, but it also followed rule. That rule was written, memorized, and enforced. It shaped expectations. It reduced uncertainty. A knight did not wonder whether there would be a meal, or whether his portion would depend on favor. The predictability of provision reinforced loyalty to the institution rather than to individual personalities. In a period when personal patronage often dominated politics, this shift toward institutional discipline was significant. Food also functioned as a boundary marker. The Templars were distinct from secular nobles not only in their vows, but in their visible habits. Their communal meals separated them from the individualized feasting culture of aristocratic courts. At the same time, they differed from purely contemplative monks by sustaining a physically demanding martial role. Their table reflected this hybrid identity, restrained but sufficient, structured but practical. The agricultural dimension remained central. Estates did more than generate income, they generated resilience. Surplus allowed preparation for siege. Diversified holdings reduced vulnerability to localized disaster. Careful record-keeping ensured continuity across leadership transitions. When a new commander assumed responsibility for a commandery, he inherited not chaos, but accounts and stores. Feeding a Templar Knight depended on this bureaucratic memory as much as on the harvest itself. We should also remember the sensory reality of these meals. The coarse texture of medieval bread, the earthy scent of legumes, the sharpness of preserved fish, the warmth of wine diluted with water. These were tangible experiences. They grounded belief in physical sensation. In a world where spiritual aspiration often aimed toward transcendence, the act of eating returned the brother to embodiment. It reminded him that faith operated within flesh. As the order expanded and became wealthier, maintaining this embodied discipline grew more symbolically important. Wealth can soften institutions from within. The Templars' rule attempted to guard against that softening by standardizing daily life. Whether every brother upheld that standard perfectly is impossible to know. But the structure existed, and for generations it shaped behavior. When political forces eventually dismantled the order, they targeted its leadership and property, not its kitchens. Yet the kitchens reveal more about the Templars' endurance than the courtrooms of their final years. Trials occupy a narrow slice of their history. Meals occupied nearly every day of it. For close to 200 years, bread was broken in stone halls under the same guiding principles. And perhaps that is where the most honest understanding lies. The Knights Templar were sustained by repetition more than by drama. Their ability to function across distances and decades depended on routine made reliable. Feeding a Templar Knight was one visible expression of that reliability. It demonstrated that fields were tilled, accounts balanced, supplies secured, and discipline maintained. If we imagine one final evening in a commandery, lamplight flickering against stone, bowls emptied, prayers concluding, we see not the grandeur of legend, but the steadiness of structure. Outside, the medieval world remains volatile. Kings negotiating alliances, merchants navigating seas, armies shifting borders. Inside, for a moment, there is calm order. That calm was not accidental. It was cultivated. It was preserved through careful stewardship of land and adherence to rule. And it was renewed every time a meal was prepared and shared without excess. In the end, feeding a Templar Knight was an act of continuity. It linked the labor of peasants to the discipline of warriors. It tied European estates to Eastern fortresses. It transformed agricultural yield into institutional longevity. Through that steady rhythm, grain to bread, bread to strength, strength to service, the Templars sustained themselves across generations. And in that rhythm, quiet and deliberate, we find the true foundation of their enduring place in medieval history. As we reach the furthest edge of this exploration, it becomes clear that feeding a Templar Knight was not simply a matter of sustaining an individual. It was about sustaining an idea across time. The Order of the Temple began with a specific purpose: to protect pilgrims and defend newly established Christian territories in the Eastern Mediterranean. But over the decades, that purpose matured into a structured institution that required constancy in the face of uncertainty. Food was one of the most visible expressions of that constancy. The medieval world was defined by fluctuation. Weather patterns shifted harvest yields. Trade routes opened and closed. Alliances strengthened or dissolved with marriage, death, or war. In such a landscape, predictability was rare and valuable. The Templars attempted to manufacture predictability through rule and organization. The refectory was a daily demonstration that this effort was working. If bread arrived on schedule, if stores were sufficient, if rations were measured calmly and without dispute, then the institution was holding steady. There is something profoundly stabilizing about routine. For a knight stationed far from his homeland, perhaps in a fortress overlooking a contested coastline, the rhythm of prayer and meal anchored his identity. The meal was not extravagant, but it was dependable. It reminded him that he belonged to a network stretching across Europe and the Mediterranean. Grain grown in one region, wine pressed in another, salt harvested from distant shores, all converged in his bowl. Feeding a Templar knight was a quiet act of geographic connection. This connection also reveals how deeply the order relied on cooperation beyond its walls. Peasants who cultivated Templar lands did so within the broader fabric of medieval society. Their harvests sustained not only their own households but also a military religious enterprise that operated far from their fields. The Templar strength was therefore rooted in relationships, with tenants, merchants, donors, and rulers. Each meal represented a chain of trust extending outward into the wider world. The discipline surrounding food reflected the order's attempt to harmonize spiritual intention with practical necessity. Medieval religious thought placed importance on moderation, seeing excess as a potential threat to humility. Yet the Templars could not afford weakness. Their mission required stamina, clarity, and physical resilience. The balance between sufficiency and restraint became part of their institutional character. Feeding a Templar knight meant ensuring that he was strong enough to fulfill his duty without drifting into indulgence. When the political climate of Europe changed in the early 14th century, the structures that had once signaled stability became sources of tension. Monarchies, particularly in France, were consolidating authority and seeking greater control over wealth within their realms. The Templars' estates, carefully managed for decades to guarantee steady provision, represented concentrated resources. Their efficiency, once admired, now appeared strategically significant. The suppression that followed was not born of famine or internal collapse, but of shifting power. Even so, the physical systems did not disappear overnight. Fields continued to be plowed. Mills continued to grind grain. Ovens continued to bake bread. The transfer of properties to other institutions ensured that agricultural cycles remained intact. In this way, the Templars' logistical legacy survived their legal dissolution. The land they had stewarded continued to yield nourishment under new oversight. And so we return for the final time to the human scale. A knight sits in quiet company. He eats bread that began as seed months earlier, grown by hands he will never meet. He drinks wine pressed from grapes tended in distant vineyards. He listens as scripture is read. Around him, brothers share the same pattern, bound by rule and repetition. There is no spectacle here, only structure. No legend, only labor made consistent. And yet, within this ordinary scene lies the true endurance of the Knights Templar. For nearly 2 centuries, they translated belief into routine, land into sustenance, discipline into durability. Feeding a Templar Knight was not dramatic. It did not inspire chronicles or epics, but it sustained the men who guarded roads, defended fortresses, and administered estates. It was the daily renewal of strength in a volatile world. In the end, the Templar story is not solely about crusade or controversy. It is about organization, about how a medieval institution built resilience through repetition. And at the heart of that repetition was a simple, steady act: the preparation and sharing of a meal. Through bread broken in stone halls, through measured portions and quiet reflection, the order sustained itself across generations, until the currents of history moved beyond its control. If we allow ourselves one final, reflective pause, we begin to see that feeding a Templar Knight was not only about sustaining an institution, it was about shaping a worldview. The medieval mind did not divide the sacred and the practical as sharply as we often do today. Labor, agriculture, prayer, governance, and nourishment were interwoven. The Templars embodied that interweaving. Their table was not separate from their theology. It expressed it. The act of eating in common reinforced equality under rule. However varied their backgrounds, once seated in the refectory, each brother submitted to the same discipline. Portions were not negotiated. They were received. This practice cultivated humility. It reminded even high-born knights that within the order, authority flowed through structure, not personal status. Feeding a Templar Knight, therefore, was part of dissolving aristocratic ego into institutional identity. At the same time, the meal affirmed hierarchy in subtle ways. Officers held responsibility for oversight. Stewards ensured distribution. Chaplains read scripture during dining. The organization of the room reflected the organization of the order itself. In that carefully structured environment, daily nourishment became rehearsal for obedience and cooperation. There is also a profound environmental dimension to consider. Medieval agriculture depended on climate patterns that were only partially understood. Years of abundance alternated with years of strain. The Templars' dispersed estates were a deliberate strategy to buffer against these uncertainties. By spreading their holdings across multiple regions, they reduced dependence on a single harvest. Feeding a Templar Knight in the Levant might depend on grain from Provence in one year and from England in another. This flexibility was a form of medieval resilience. But resilience required foresight. Grain had to be stored in dry conditions. Livestock had to be protected from disease. Trade routes had to remain open. Maritime transport had to navigate storms and piracy. The order's leadership could not rely on improvisation alone. They relied on planning, record-keeping, and repetition. In that sense, feeding a Templar Knight was evidence that foresight had succeeded. The Templar suppression in the early 14th century did not arise from internal collapse of these systems. Their granaries were not empty. Their estates were not barren. Instead, political shifts made their organizational independence problematic for certain rulers. Yet, even in dissolution, the agricultural networks they cultivated endured. The land continued to produce. The ovens continued to bake. The structure proved transferable, even if the name did not. When we strip away centuries of legend, stories of hidden treasure, secret rituals, coded mysteries, we find something more grounded and perhaps more impressive. We find an institution that sustained itself across distance and time through disciplined management of ordinary necessities. The glamour of crusade fades beside the quiet competence of storage and distribution. Imagine, for the last time, the rhythm of a single day in a commandery. Dawn prayer, duties assigned, horses exercised, fields inspected, counts reviewed, midday meals served in silence, work resumed, evening prayer, supper modest and measured, lamps extinguished. The pattern repeats tomorrow. Through thousands of such days, the Knights Templar endured. They did not survive because they were extraordinary in mythic ways. They survived because they mastered the fundamentals of organization in a demanding era. Feeding a Templar Knight was one visible thread in that larger fabric. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson. History is often carried forward not by moments of spectacle, but by structures of steadiness. The Templars' ability to transform harvest into strength and strength into service allowed them to shape medieval history for nearly 2 centuries. In the quiet passing of bread across a wooden table, we glimpse the true foundation of their power. Not drama, not secrecy, but discipline sustained over time. That steady discipline, expressed in fields tilled, stores counted, and meals shared, was the engine of their endurance. And in that steady rhythm, repeated day after day beneath stone arches, the Knights Templar once found the strength to continue. If we allow this story to settle into its deepest layer, we begin to see that feeding a Templar Knight ultimately reflects the medieval understanding of stewardship. The Knights Templar did not see land merely as wealth. Land was responsibility. It required oversight, labor, and continuity. A poorly managed estate weakened the order just as surely as a poorly defended fortress. Every field plowed under their authority carried the weight of their mission. Stewardship meant thinking beyond the present moment. Grain harvested in late summer had to last through winter. Salted provisions prepared in one season might sustain a garrison months later. Wine pressed in autumn might travel across seas before it was poured into a cup. Feeding a Templar Knight required imagining tomorrow's hunger while standing in today's abundance. It required resisting the temptation to consume surplus without planning for scarcity. This discipline extended to the human body itself. The order understood that strength was cumulative. A knight who ate moderately and consistently would endure longer than one who alternated between excess and deprivation. The rule attempted to smooth extremes. In that smoothing, it built durability. Feeding a Templar Knight was less about indulgence and more about maintenance. Steady input for steady output. The communal nature of their meals also served as a daily reaffirmation of shared burden. No brother ate alone by preference. Isolation was not the goal. The order's power lay in unity. When bread was divided, it symbolized more than nutrition. It symbolized common purpose. The same loaf sustained men who might the next day ride together into uncertainty. In this way, food reinforced cohesion. It is also important to recognize how food linked the Templars to broader economic transformations of their time. The 12th and 13th centuries saw expansion in trade networks, growth in urban centers, and increasing sophistication in financial practices. The Templars participated in this evolving economy. Their estates were not isolated farms. They were integrated into regional markets. Grain might be sold, livestock traded, surplus reinvested. Feeding a Templar Knight was connected to this larger economic current. Yet, for all their sophistication, the order remained grounded in agrarian reality. Without harvest, there was no revenue. Without revenue, there was no provisioning. Without provisioning, there was no endurance. The political shifts that ultimately dismantled the order did not erase this logic. They simply transferred stewardship to other hands. When the suppression unfolded in the early 14th century, it interrupted leadership and identity, but it did not interrupt the agricultural cycle. Fields still demanded tending. Livestock still required care. The everyday work of nourishment continued. That continuity reveals something essential. Institutions may rise and fall, but the human need for sustenance endures beyond them. If we imagine the final years before dissolution, the rhythm inside commanderies likely felt unchanged. Bread still arrived at the table. Brothers still bowed their heads before eating. The routine was intact even as the political foundation shifted beneath it. That contrast between internal steadiness and external upheaval captures the fragility of medieval power. And so we come, at last, to a simple but profound conclusion. Feeding a Templar Knight was the quiet expression of an entire worldview. It united land, labor, faith, hierarchy, and foresight into a single repeated act. It demonstrated that even the most ambitious missions must be rooted in practical care. The Knights Templar shaped medieval history not only through battle or diplomacy, but through their ability to organize the ordinary. Their endurance depended on the steady transformation of seed into bread, bread into strength, strength into service. In the stillness of a refectory at dusk, lamplight against stone, bowls set evenly, scripture read softly, we see the heart of their achievement. Not spectacle but structure, not mystery but management, not excess but balance. Feeding a Templar Knight was never glamorous. Yet within that unremarkable act lay the foundation of 2 centuries of resilience. And in that steady, disciplined rhythm, we find the most honest image of who they truly were. If we allow the narrative to rest in its quietest register, one final insight comes forward. Feeding a Templar Knight was ultimately about continuity in a world that rarely offered it. Medieval Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean were landscapes of disruption. Dynasties ended abruptly. Campaigns overturned borders. Plague, famine, and conflict could alter communities within a single generation. Against that backdrop, any institution that endured for nearly 2 centuries had to cultivate internal stability with unusual care. The Knights Templar achieved this stability not through grand architecture alone, nor solely through battlefield effectiveness, but through disciplined repetition. The repetition of prayer, the repetition of training, and, crucially, the repetition of meals governed by rule. Each shared meal was a small act of order imposed upon uncertainty. Bread broken at the same hour each day reinforced the idea that structure could outlast turmoil. There is something deeply human in that rhythm. Hunger is universal. No vow exempts a body from its needs. By embedding nourishment within a regulated communal framework, the Templars ensured that physical necessity did not undermine spiritual aspiration. The Knight did not choose extravagance, nor did he embrace neglect. He accepted sufficiency. That acceptance cultivated humility while preserving strength. The agricultural base that made this possible was both ordinary and remarkable. Ordinary because it depended on familiar medieval practices: plowing, sowing, harvesting, milling. Remarkable because it was coordinated across vast distances. Estates in England, France, Iberia, and Italy all contributed to a broader mission. Ships crossed the Mediterranean carrying goods that had been grown months earlier. Feeding a Templar knight in the Levant might reflect the labor of dozens of communities he would never see. This web of connection highlights the order's administrative sophistication. Medieval communication was slow. Decisions had to anticipate delay. Supplies had to be prepared well in advance. Leadership required patience and foresight. The fact that the Templars sustained such coordination for generations suggests not only discipline, but adaptability. When harvests failed in one region, alternatives were found. When political alliances shifted, routes were adjusted. The meal at the table represented solutions quietly implemented long before the knight lifted his spoon. As monarchy strengthened in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Templars' very competence became politically significant. They were not merely warriors. They were landholders, financiers, and logisticians. Their ability to sustain mounted knights reliably across continents implied independence. In an era moving toward centralized authority, such independence could be viewed as threat as much as asset. Yet, even in suppression, the practical foundation of their existence endured. Once properties were transferred to other institutions, agricultural cycles continued. Grain was still harvested. Wine was still pressed. The land did not recognize political decree. It responded to weather, labor, and care. In this sense, the Templars' logistical legacy outlived their institutional name. And so, in our final image, we return not to the courtroom of their trials or the battlefield of their campaigns, but to the refectory. The stone walls are cool. The air carries the scent of bread and broth. A knight, weary perhaps from patrol or study, sits among his brothers. He receives his portion without excess. A reading echoes softly. The day's labor pauses, then resumes. Within that quiet scene lies the truth of their endurance. Feeding a Templar knight was not dramatic, but it was decisive. It sustained the men who guarded roads and fortified cities. It reinforced the rule that shaped their identity. Connected distant lands through disciplined stewardship. History often magnifies climactic events, yet it is built upon the steady cadence of ordinary acts. For the Knights Templar, those acts included the cultivation of fields, the maintenance of granaries, and the sharing of measured meals beneath stone arches. Through that rhythm, grain to bread, bread to strength, strength to service, the order maintained itself across generations. And in that rhythm, quiet and deliberate, we glimpse the most grounded explanation for how they endured as long as they did. Feeding a Templar knight was simple, but in that simplicity, the full complexity of medieval institutional life was sustained, day after day, until history turned in another direction. If we let the lens widen one final time, beyond the refectory and beyond even the estates, feeding a Templar knight begins to look like a case study in how medieval Europe organized power through sustenance. The 12th and 13th centuries were not static. They were centuries of expansion, agricultural growth, demographic increase, commercial development, and institutional experimentation. The Templars were one of the most striking examples of that experimentation. A brotherhood that fused monastic discipline with mounted warfare and local agriculture with international coordination. But experimentation only succeeds when it becomes routine. The Order's founding vision might have been dramatic, born in the aftermath of the First Crusade, but its survival depended on ordinary repetition. Feeding a Templar knight every day for nearly 200 years required more than enthusiasm. It required systems resilient enough to absorb shock, crop failures, naval losses, regional conflict, leadership transitions. Think of the chain behind a single meal. Peasant family tills soil in Burgundy. Months later, grain is harvested and milled under the supervision of a Templar steward. The flour is recorded in accounts, stored carefully against moisture, perhaps transported to a port. A ship carries barrels across the Mediterranean. In a Levantine fortress, the grain is baked into bread. A knight breaks that bread before returning to his duties. The simplicity of the final act conceals the complexity of the journey. This complexity required trust at every link. Trust that tenants would meet obligations. Trust that stewards would not divert resources. Trust that ships would reach harbor. Trust that leaders would allocate provisions wisely. Feeding a Templar knight was therefore not only about calories. It was about confidence in a network stretching across continents. There is also a temporal dimension worth noticing. Medieval institutions thought in seasons and years rather than in rapid cycles. Planning meant anticipating winter in summer and summer in winter. Salted fish prepared today might sustain men months later. Wine laid down in cask might travel far before being consumed. The Order's longevity rested on this patient relationship with time. A fortress could be built in years, but it had to be sustained daily. A campaign might last months, but it depended on harvests planned long before. The refectory embodied this patient continuity. Meals were predictable, not spectacular. The absence of extravagance was deliberate. The Templars understood that endurance required moderation. Too much indulgence eroded discipline. Too little nourishment eroded strength. The narrow path between those extremes defined their internal culture. As European monarchies strengthened, especially in France under Philip IV, the Templars' discipline network became politically sensitive. Their lands, Revenues and cross-border coordination represented a form of organized authority that did not fit neatly within emerging centralized states. When the suppression began in 1307, it did not reflect agricultural failure. It reflected a recalibration of political power. Yet even then, the agricultural machinery did not collapse. Estates were transferred primarily to the hospitallers. The fields continued to yield grain. The mills continued to grind. Bread continued to be baked in ovens once supervised by Templar brothers. The continuity of nourishment outlasted the discontinuity of identity. This endurance underscores a final truth. The Templars' greatest achievement was not mystical secrecy or battlefield spectacle. It was institutional coherence grounded in material reality. They built a structure capable of sustaining men across distance and time through careful stewardship of land and disciplined distribution of food. If we imagine, one last time, the evening light filtering through narrow windows, we see a knight seated calmly among his brothers. His armor may rest nearby. His horse waits in the stable. Before him lies bread and broth, simple, sufficient, prepared without excess. A reading echoes softly across stone walls. Outside, politics shift and kingdoms maneuver. Inside, for this moment, order prevails. That order, expressed in the steady rhythm of shared meals, was the quiet foundation of the Knights Templar. Through grain sown, harvested, stored, and divided, they converted land into longevity. They sustained belief through biology. They turned routine into resilience. Feeding a Templar knight was an act repeated thousands upon thousands of times, largely unnoticed by chroniclers. Yet without it, no fortress would have held. No patrol would have ridden, no mission would have endured. In the end, history is often sustained by what appears most ordinary. For the Knights Templar, the path from seed to bread, from bread to strength, from strength to service, was the true engine of their survival. And in that steady, deliberate rhythm, meal after measured meal, we find the most grounded explanation for how they endured for nearly 2 centuries in a world defined by uncertainty. If we bring this long reflection to its deepest, most grounded conclusion, we can say that feeding a Templar knight was not simply an act of provision, it was an act of preservation. Preservation of strength, of discipline, of unity, and ultimately of institutional identity. The Knights Templar did not endure because they were invincible. They endured because they built a system that could sustain human bodies reliably across distance and time. Medieval institutions lived or died by their ability to convert land into stability. Grain was more than food. It was stored time. A full granary meant weeks, sometimes months, of security. Salted meat meant endurance beyond the harvest season. Wine in cask meant both sustenance and sacramental continuity. Feeding a Templar knight meant that the order had successfully transformed agricultural cycles into operational readiness. What is remarkable is not that they ate bread and stew, so did most of medieval Europe, but that they organized this simplicity into a disciplined, replicable framework. A knight entering a commandery in England would recognize the same basic rhythm as one stationed in the Levant. Prayer structured the day. Meals punctuated it. Portions were measured. Silence or scripture accompanied nourishment. The structure itself was the achievement. This consistency created internal cohesion across regions that differed in language, climate, and politics. A Burgundian noble and an English landholder might have little in common culturally. Yet, at the Templar table they were brothers under rule. Feeding a Templar Knight was part of dissolving local identity into shared purpose. The refectory was a daily rehearsal of unity. Behind that unity stood an administrative network of unusual sophistication for its time. Estates were catalogued, rents recorded, inventories kept, supplies transported with foresight rather than improvisation. Medieval communication was slow, but the Templars compensated through anticipation. They did not wait for crisis. They prepared for it. A garrison could withstand siege only if someone months earlier had thought to store grain properly. And so the meal becomes a visible sign of invisible planning. When a knight lifted bread to his lips, he was benefiting from decisions made by stewards, farmers, merchants, and commanders. Each meal represented trust that systems were working beyond his sight. There is also something philosophically revealing in their moderation. Medieval Christianity emphasized self-control as a path to spiritual clarity. The Templars extended that ideal into a martial context. Strength without restraint risked pride. Restraint without strength risked weakness. Their dietary rule attempted to balance these forces. Feeding a Templar Knight was therefore a form of ethical training as well as nourishment. When the political climate shifted and suppression came in the early 14th century, the order did not fall because its kitchens failed. Its granaries were not empty. Its estates were not bankrupt. Instead, it faced the consolidation of royal authority and the strategic ambitions of powerful monarchs. The very coherence that had sustained it made it visible and politically significant. Yet even in dissolution, the land endured. Fields once stewarded by Templar brothers continued to yield harvest under new administration. The agricultural model proved transferable. The identity changed. The cycle did not. If we imagine the final years before their suppression, daily life likely retained its rhythm right up until disruption. Bread was baked. Bowls were filled. Scripture was read. The quiet persistence of routine continued even as external forces gathered momentum. That contrast between internal steadiness and external upheaval underscores the fragility of institutional life. And so, at the very end of this exploration, we return to the simplest image: a long wooden table in a stone hall. A knight sits among his brothers. He eats modestly but sufficiently. He prepares to rise and resume his duties. Outside, the medieval world shifts, alliances forming, rulers calculating, trade moving across seas. In that modest meal lies the core of the Templars' endurance. Feeding a Templar Knight was the daily renewal of capacity. It was how belief was translated into strength and strength into service. It was how land became loyalty and loyalty became longevity. The Knights Templar have been remembered for battles and for trials, but their true durability rested on something far quieter: the steady transformation of harvest into sustenance, sustained over generations. In that rhythm, grain to bread, bread to strength, strength to duty, we find the most grounded explanation for how they endured as long as they did. And in that quiet, disciplined act of nourishment, shared beneath stone arches day after day, the foundation of their history once stood.